All right, welcome to the 2024 Duluth Dillon Fest John Bushey Memorial Lecture. I'm Mark Nicklawske. I'm on the Dillon Fest committee. And we got a great lineup here for you today on the John Bushey Lecture. First of all, we should say John Bushey, big shout out to him. Yeah, let's give him a hand. Of course, John passed in 2018, but of course he's been instrumental in founding this festival and just making it become what it is today. Yeah, he's also runs the Highway 61 Revisited radio show. He founded that on what was KUMD. It's now the North 103.3, and Miriam Hansen is now the host. So that's one thing we have coming up on our schedule. Is Miriam's show is today at 6 o'clock. So tune in for that tonight. Later, but 5 o'clock. All right. 5 to 6, right on. That's it. Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Let's get going. Well, today's panel is we're highlighting Bob Dylan in Minnesota, the book by K.G. Miles, but we have 4 of the contributors here, which really is the meat of the book. Our 4 authors from Minnesota, and of course the book is about Minnesota, and really excited to hear what our panel has to say about how they got involved with this book. K.G. Miles is from England, so he's put a lot of his work in from England, but of course he needs ground troops here in Minnesota, and that's what we have. Your program, lists their credentials for everybody, but let's have the guys introduce themselves quickly, and then we'll move on with some questions. Paul, you're first here.
If you hear me screaming, I threw my back out. My dog took me down on Wednesday night. Now, I'm not going to completely blame the dog. There was a couple of Bloody Marys involved. But I don't have an upstairs light. We were going to bed, and I had my flashlight on my phone, and Blue was going, "Come on, Dad, time to go to bed." Hit me right at the knees. So, I don't know if it's a broken rib, busted rib, but anyway, that's why I might be moaning and groaning, other than enjoying listening to what Percansky has to say.
Sounds like a blues song.
Well, when Paul says to me, I don't remember what happened, but it happened.
But anyway, I'm Paul Metsa, and for the last 2 years, I've been living in Lincoln Park, right around the corner. But I'm proud to say, I'm looking at my landlord. When I first moved up here, it just fell out of the sky. I rented the first floor of Bob Dylan's childhood home from July 2021 till 2022. So let's hear it from my landlord, Bill Pagel.
All right, then we have Ed Newman. Ed,
I'm Ed Newman, a retired advertising marketing guy for over 30 years and a writer for over 40 years. And I don't want to take any more time because the meat of the stuff is to come.
Yeah, Mark Percansky.
Yeah, Mark Percansky. I'm from Minneapolis, born and raised. Live in St. Louis Park. Anybody from Minneapolis here besides this guy? Or the Twin Cities? Okay. Where are you from?
Minneapolis.
All right, Minneapolis, St. Louis Park, and
Ireland.
Ireland. Okay, we got someone from Ireland. Way to be. Silver Bay is in the house. We're gonna have a party. I'm honored to be here with everybody. I got stories about all these guys and how I got here. I wouldn't be here without them writing a book, and I can go into detail on that and all that, but I'm kind of hard set up about the John Bushey Lecture. Being honored to be a part of the John Bushey Lecture. He was a dear friend of mine, and I know, and I will read some about Keith Miles, our author, if you'd like me to. He sent a note over. I know that if John was here today, this book would have another author.
Oh, yeah.
For sure. He'd be calling me and saying, "Mark, this guy contacted me from London, you gotta do it. You're in the book." He would have been picked. So I felt out about him, the whole writing of the book, and how he would have been a part of it. Miss him dearly. And I have, for good luck, his magic wand given to me by his sister, Barbara Bushey. So he's here tonight in spirit. This is a wonderful thing you do for the John Bushey Lecture in honor of him, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Great. And then we have Matt Steichen.
Hi, yeah. My name is Matt Steichen. I did this lecture actually by myself last year. Some of you guys were here. And actually, I'm relieved that I don't have to come up with an hour of talking by myself this year. This should be much easier. But I've been a Bob Dylan fan for a very long time. I met my wife at a Bob Dylan concert. I was a newspaper reporter for a long time, and now I work in communications and marketing in the Twin Cities.
Well, yeah, let's welcome the panel. Sure. You know, one of the, if you haven't picked up the book yet, you know, it's titled Bob Dylan in Minnesota. And, you know, what struck me about it as I was reading it is it's not only a, in-depth look at Bob and how he's worked and lived in Minnesota, but it's also like a good tourist book. You know, if you're not from Minnesota and you're not really super familiar with Bob, but you're curious, I mean, great book to pick up. And, you know, just go to different landmarks and throughout Minnesota and learn more about them.
It's a Rand McNally for beatniks.
Yeah, for Dylan fans.
That's
Right. Just here in Minnesota, it's a great piece. And, you know, it also talks a lot about Bob's, you know, how Minnesota has influenced his work and his songwriting and his music. And so that's, you know, things you just don't know unless you're experts like these guys. And so let's, you know, get to the questions. You know, the first one that I have was, you know, how did you get involved with the project? I mean, KG lives in England, right? So, I mean, how did you connect with him? Let's go with Ed first.
Well, he contacted me, and because I'm a blogger, I have written 6,000 blog posts since 2007, and it seemed like about 15 to 20% were about Bob Dylan, I guess. Some people think, well, for what it's worth, that I know something about him. And I've covered all the Dylan Fest, so he contacted me and asked me to write a chapter about the Duluth Dylan Fest. And within a short period of time, I sent that in, and then I was part of the whole story. He sent me sent all of these guys the outline of the book, and I thought, there's a lot more to Duluth than just the Dylan Fest. There's a house here that Bob Dylan lived in. There's a hospital he was born in. There's an armory where he saw Buddy Holly. And so each time I'd say, well, you need to have something about this. KG said, well, would you write it? And I ended up writing 7 chapters in the book.
Yeah, great stuff. Mark, how'd you get involved?
I don't know any of these guys. I don't know where I met any of them. I'm telling you, just got lucky. Actually, let me see. Well, Keith contacted me, KG Mouse. He sent a note here, if I could read it to all of us, because he'd like to be here.
Great note.
His name's Keith, KG Miles. He lives in England. And he really picked all 4 of us. We didn't choose each other, yet we were all friends. And we all came on board. You know, at first he contacted me and said, I thought he wanted me to help him put the book together. So I suggested Paul Metsa and different people I know, and it took me about a month till he said, I want you to write something. Write a troubadour tale. So I thought, cool, that's cool. A troubadour tale, it can be true or false, right? I can make it up or wing it. I kind of like that stuff. So then I thought about it, and my mom was sick. She was very ill, and I said, all right. I said yes to him. And I started writing. So here's what he said to me, a little bit kind of a question Paul asked me today. What does Bob Dylan mean to Duluth, and what does Duluth mean to Bob Dylan? Write about that. So I had to think about that. I mean, we can all in this room write something like that, right? Yeah. By natives of Duluth and all that. I wrote the worst garbage you've ever heard. Deleted it, gave up, said I quit. Keith, I talked to him and said, I can't write anything, but I can tell it to you. Let me just do a Zoom, and I'll tell it to you, and you write it. He goes, okay, he didn't want to really do that. So he says, write anything. And at that point, my mom had passed away, and I thought about what I was writing. And it goes back to when I did a concert with Nelson T. French. I came up here with my salute to the music of Bob Dylan, invented by this guy. Follow me on this, it'll all make sense. And I'm doing the concert, and he hooks me up with this guy, who interviews me over the phone, a couple interviews. They're on his blog, and I became a fan of him and his blog, and I read those, and I went back to those when I had to write something because I thought they were good, you know. So that was my first interviews I ever really did. did one with John Breen, but it didn't come out right at all. So it was okay. And then so his help, Paul's help getting me involved in all the Blood on the Track stuff. Paul talks about me a little in his Blue Guitar Highway book, because we hung out in LA. Went up to Harry Houdini's house.
In your DeLorean.
In my DeLorean. So
That was freaking cool.
hung out there during his Whistling Past the Graveyard album that he put out. Great album. Great album. So I was thrilled. Paul's on board. I'm going, okay, great. And I ended up writing 4 chapters for this guy in the afterword. Paul wanted the forward, so he gave him the forward. And I wrote a lot, and I'll talk more about that. But let me read what Keith says from the UK, okay? He says, I was a small child on the Isle of Wight when Bob Dylan landed in 1969. He brought with him 100,000 people who, to a boy from South London, looked like they could have come from the moon. As a teenager, I knew only 2 things with real certainty: that Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon, and that Bob Dylan was born in Duluth, Minnesota. Bob Dylan became not only the sound of my youth, but the soundtrack to my life, and at age 64, he is still singing away in the background. It's been a real pleasure to put together the successful Troubadour Tales books, and the 4th and final one was always going to be Bob's homeland, Duluth, Hibbing, and Dinkytown. And I knew I would need to do this supreme justice. To do so, I put together a team who not only bring and combine the Dylan knowledge with an understanding of Minnesota that is pretty much second to none, but Mark and Matt and Ed and Paul, boy oh boy, can they write. Of many Bob Dylan and Minnesota highlights is the last interview with the Minnesota Colossus Spider John Kerner before his recent demise. Rest easy, big man. Enjoy the festival, folks. Sadly, I can't be with you, but I am in the midst of a move to Wales. Mark and Matt and Ed and Paul, the Troubadour Tales stars and the Minnesota Fab Four, will be bringing it all back home for you today in Bob Dylan in Minnesota. Cheers, Keith.
Yeah, I think KG Miles might be a good candidate for this lecture sometime in the future. So we'll have to work on that to get him over here. Matt, how did you get involved?
So I run a Twitter page that basically serves as a Bob Dylan news and information site, and Keith's followed me for many years and I followed him. And one of the times that I came up here as a Bob Dylan tourist, posted a bunch of pictures of my kids in front of the house in Duluth and the house in Hibbing and in the Hibbing High School auditorium playing the piano he played when he was a kid. So Keith saw this, and he was working on his Troubadour Tales, his next one for Minnesota. And basically, I was the audience for the book, Bob Dylan Tourists. And he saw that, so he wanted to use my photos, was the first thing. And so a lot of those are in the book. And then he asked me if I wanted to write anything. And to me, Bob Dylan, his time in Minnesota is always, or often at least, overlooked by a lot of people as far as how it shaped him, his outlook on the world. He's even said, I wouldn't have been who I became if I hadn't grown up in Minnesota. He said that in 1985. So, you know, that's a very important a role in his life to shape a giant of American art and culture. So, you know, we wanted to, he wanted to have my perspective, and so I thought it was a good opportunity to get some of the Bob Dylan tidbits and random trivia and nerdy stuff that not that many people know, and make sure that that was in the book. So I tried to add that.
Yeah, great connection to Minnesota. And Paul, you wrote the foreword, so talk about how'd you get, what were you thinking there?
Well, it's my favorite Bob Dylan line from It's All Over Now, Baby Blues. Take what you've gathered from coincidence. And I had been, you know, I grew up in Virginia, Minnesota, which is 22 miles east of Hibbing. And when I was just old enough to hitchhike, 13 or 14, I'd hitchhike over because, you know, 1965, when Like a Rolling Stone came out, everybody's talking about this guy, Bobby Dylan. And there's people on the iron range that still refer to him as Bobby Dylan. And I would hitchhike over, stand in front of his house at 2425 7th Avenue, and go, the young man that walked out of those doors is in the process of changing American culture as we speak. One thing leads to another. I spent 40 years in the music business and put out 12 records. Now the combined sales of all of them with downloads, albums, and LPs, they've all officially gone linoleum. And one thing led to another. COVID happened, and I was going to move out of Minneapolis, so I did 5,000 or 6,000 shows in the course of my career. And I knew Bill Pagel, who owns both the Dillon House and the Hibbing House, and I had gotten a hold of him just about a year earlier, and I said, I'm thinking about coming up to Duluth. And he said, no, I've got a long-term renter, and it was just kind of a pipe dream anyway. And when I decided to put my house for sale, it was a duplex in Northeast Minneapolis. It was like giving candy to a baby. And it sold in 3 days. Just about the same time, Bill called me and said, are you still interested in coming up? I said, yeah. He goes, when? I said, I got to be out of my house by June 21st. And he said, the house is open June 1. So I moved up, and part of my renter's duties was I had to man the guest book. And so, which was really fascinating, because people, like a lot of you, Bob Dylan fans, now there's one woman that I've talked to who goes by the name of Sunbonnet Sue that doesn't agree with this, but most Bob Dylan fans I met are really polite. So I'd be having coffee in the morning, and people would be coming by and starting shooting photographs. So over the course of a year there, and especially during the warmer weather, I got about signatures and names, and I'd have them write their name, date, and then put where they're from. So I had people from 5 different countries, couples, retired couples in their RVs, teenagers from Wisconsin youth camps, a lot of delightful people. And then if we kind of hit it off and we were getting along, I'd grab one of my CDs and give it to them. And I told Bill, I said, it's kind of like the Jehovah's Witnesses in reverse.
Well, I wonder how many, Bill, how many have signed your book from other countries now? It was 5 when Paul, I mean, are you in the...
Probably about 40 countries.
40 different countries now have visited.
I've had China, Russia.
So yeah, I mean, you can see it's an international tourist hub, and that's really what makes this book so great, is that
and I was having lunch, late breakfast with Bill the day I got the call from KG Miles, and so I said I'm sitting here with the great mysterious Bill Pagel. So we got done chatting, and I told Bill, and Bill said, why didn't he call me? And I go, that's a damn good question. That'll be volume 2.
But I know the answer to that. He doesn't talk.
Yeah, that's true.
I can't think of a better person to actually write the foreword.
He doesn't want it.
Than Paul. I mean, somebody who actually lived in the house.
I was living in the house while I wrote it, and I also finished 2 other books while I lived there. It was a very productive time.
Yeah.
It was, I wrote a book with a guy named Rick Shevchik called Blood in the Tracks, the Minnesota musicians behind Dylan's masterpiece. And then I self-published this book. Maybe I can read a little bit more about my reflection. It's called Alphabet Jazz, Poetry, Prose, Stories, and Songs. But I have a piece in here called Highway 53 Revisited, about how I think the majority of Dylan's touchstones as a human being were forged on the Iron Range, and then spending his time in Duluth with Louis Kemp. But he's a total northeastern Minnesota dude.
Definitely, yeah. Let's go.
See, he has 4 books. We're all riding his coattails. I did it from the beginning. I didn't stand a chance. And I'm glad I wrote my Blood on the Tracks portion, which he had me do before Blood on the Tracks came out. Because that book is the definitive version of it.
Thank you.
So, couldn't compete with that. Got it in there.
That's one.
Yeah.
That's the one that has the big Minnesota connection,
Yes.
And
Yes.
well, let's talk about the Minnesota connection, and it makes for just a more interesting book for readers that you're from Minnesota, right? And Mark, maybe kick this one off. Why from Minnesota does it make it more interesting?
This particular book, well, it's cool when you read it in the logic of the trilogy of books. They're like little pocket guides. They want them this size, put them in your book. By the way, it is for sale here. I had to throw that in there. As well as Paul's Alphabet Jazz for sale here.
I just brought one, but I'll sell it.
Anyhow, but this book was a no-brainer to have us involved. I mean, it was cool that he picked us. We do know stuff about him, and I think each one of us got together, kind of work as a team. But what Keith said is the first book and there's so many books on Bob out there, there's endless amounts. This is the first one that covers 3 main areas in one book. and talks fully about them. Duluth, Hibbing, and the very underplayed Dinkytown portion of his career. You know, not many people even know about that. I mean, it's what went on there, but that was his
Well,
stepping stone to New York.
Yeah, and with
That's-
Spider John dying too, there's been a lot of that coming out, how Spider John helped Bob.
Yes, because we do have an interview with Spider John in here, one of his last, I think.
And you're not going to get that in another book, are you?
No, so it was cool, and we got together, and we all worked very hard with our hearts to make a really good book on a definitive book on Bob Dylan. We did our best, we helped each other edit, went over our mistakes, what I didn't know, he knew, of course. And then there's little maps at the back. I don't know if you guys, how many people have the book already? Is that, all right, that's not too bad, that's pretty good. So there's maps at the back, and these 3 maps, if you look at them, are really cool. I did the Dinkytown one, pretty easy. It's 4 blocks, and I pinpointed all in. We needed a Hibbing one, okay? So the Hibbing one, we couldn't find it. The maps went in at the last moment. They were almost left out completely because we couldn't finish them. We had a deadline. Production of the book was about 14 months, cover to cover, and we couldn't get the Hibbing one in. So he comes up with a little black and white diagram of the area of Hibbing. Hold on, he says. In 10 minutes, he's pinpointing every single spot in Hibbing to the exact T with the addresses, and that went in the book. So he did the Hibbing one. It was wonderful, excellent job, and it's pretty accurate, I must say. Ed did the Duluth one, which was hard to get that whole map in there. I don't know, and then get everything in there. And I kind of pushed out the borderline of Dinkytown to include the mural and the Hennepin Avenue stuff and all that. So we worked on all that together, and Paul's stuff was pretty much written by himself because we didn't want to monkey with the master.
But I do have to thank Ed because
Yes.
he's the king of the word processor and how to put things into the proper place to share files. Editor Ed, thank you very much.
Yes. So yeah, most of the Duluth stuff came from him. I mean, there's even a chapter on the Duluth Dylan Fest. Maybe one of us could read in here. You know, if you want to know about that. If you don't know about that, that's in here.
Yeah, man,
So-
you grew up in Minnesota.
Yeah, there
you know,
you go.
talk about that. You know, the fact that you're from Minnesota and how it affected the way you wrote your chapter.
I actually grew up in Iowa, so that's not even true. I came to Minnesota because I went to a Bob Dylan concert in Minnesota, and she was there, so I stayed. It was Rochester in 2004.
Minnesota?
Yeah. At the ballpark at Mayo Field.
I was there.
Yeah, a lot of you guys were there.
That's where I met him.
No, but I think the strength of the book, you know, people have a lot of different levels of interest in Bob Dylan, and some people are borderline or if not completely crazy. Some people are more casual about it, but I think in this book, if, you know, Paul is a great storyteller. He's an Iron Ranger. He followed in Bob's footsteps like a lot of musicians have. Ed is a historian and is an expert on music and culture, and Mark's got really detailed personal stories about being around Bob, and then I just kind of filled in the gaps everywhere else with the you know, random trivia and tidbits, you know, that really over the top detailed people might want to know. So I think we covered a lot of bases.
But Matt, what you've done, you've gone way beyond us, because Matt has, and his lovely wife over here, has 4 children, and they're all named Bob. Like George Foreman's got 5 sons named George. Cool.
And because it's a perspective too of a non-Minnesotan who's kind of come to Minnesota and discovered, you know, really the roots of Bob Dylan here. So that's
It's a pretty special guy you got from up here.
Yeah, right on. Yeah.
Is there something in the water?
That's why people are interested in it, because it's hard to fathom that someone, you know, with that level of creativity and genius in his particular field, and it's a field that a lot of people are interested in, popular culture, music, one of the big popular art forms of the 20th century. He came along and revolutionized it in a way that made people really interested. Like, how did this guy have these ideas and put them together? And so that makes them interested in coming here and seeing, you know, where it all came together.
Where it came from, exactly, Paul. And you grew up in the same town where Bob grew up.
Yeah, 22 miles away.
Yeah.
But it was, and what I love, I lived in the last 20 years in Minneapolis, in northeast Minneapolis, was a Polish part of town, very working class. All of a sudden, new band, new restaurant became kind of the go-to. And I'm seeing the same thing in Lincoln Park, very working class part of town. We got Wussow's Cafe, River City Records, Bent Paddle. But what I'd like to say about Lincoln Park, it's exactly like the Iron Range. without the guilt.
Well, what was it like, when you were a kid in Virginia, how was Bob received up there then?
Well, there was always a really great music scene on the Iron Range. In fact, Bill Berg, who played drums on Blood on the Tracks on the 5 sessions, he said something. There's another great book we should mention. That's Kevin Odegaard's Simple Twist of Fate. Kevin played guitar on Tangled Up in Blue. His book came out 2005, available on Amazon. And after the book I wrote, Shevchik, Blood in the Tracks, came out, somebody messaged me and said, you should have been at the book release for Odegaard's Simple Twist of Fate, because he had all the musicians. They were all still living. Since then, we've lost Chris Weber and Peter Ostrushko. And part of that presentation, Bill graduated from Hibbing High School in 1964 and used to play in a combo with David Zimmerman, Bob's brother. But I dig this, and this is part of a very long answer to your question. But Bill Berg said the only way he could have got through an almost 10-minute version of playing Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts had he not been trained playing polka music on the Iron Range. Because there's not such a thing as especially in the dance floor, as a 10-minute polka song. That's like 3 minutes in the polka world. Yeah.
Ed, what about you? The Minnesota thing, talk about how you came to Bob in Minnesota.
I think my perspective in the book is colored by the fact that I'm an outsider. I was born in Cleveland, grew up in New Jersey, married somebody lovely from here, and all of a sudden, one of the first things I noticed was just the working class versus the wealthy. When you see the way this town is, it's much more concealed, I think, in other parts of the country. And I understood working man's blues and some of the attitudes that Bob had, taking the side of the people who were victims of injustice, so to speak. I mean, Jewish families couldn't belong to our Northland Country Club, and so that was all a surprise to me. But I'm a journalist of sorts, and so I'm interested in stories. And over time, I kept running into interesting people stories. So like, I was at a friend's house and somebody else was there, and they said, you know that the security guard at Fond du Duluth, he played Monopoly with Bob Dylan. And so then I go down there, and there's this old guy sitting there, and I say, by the way, did you know Bob Dylan? And then I get a story, and that's a blog post, and go to one of our Buddy Holly things, and meet somebody who was at Fargo Moorhead when Buddy Holly's plane crashed, and she described the scene, so that's a blog post. There's stories all around us. It's just we don't record them. They kind of frequently we're overloaded with stories, but there's stories inside everybody. People that Bob went to school with that we've gotten to know, and being part of the Dylan Fest, then of course brings it off to the surface. And because I'm writing about it, people feed me stories. Well, this person, so and so, it's been a lot of fun if you're a fan and you keep getting to hear stories that nobody else knows.
Yeah, well, this is a question for Ed and Matt. Do you think by coming to Minnesota it made you a bigger Bob Dylan fan, or, were you already too far gone?
Well, I slept in my car in the parking lot the first day I came here for a Bob Dylan concert, so I've stayed at that high level probably.
How many shows have you seen?
50 on the button now.
Nice.
Ed, how about you? Did you appreciate his music more than you were here, or sounds like you did a lot of investigation and research into some of like his lyrics.
Yeah, I'm one of those. In David Kinney's book, he describes different kinds of fans, and there's the people that dig into the lyrics, and there's people like Matt and others who go to the concerts, and there's all different facets. And I am kind of the philosopher type that analyzes. And I think the biggest shock for me coming here was with, you hear in New Jersey, you hear a song, Desolation O, and it's powerful, but you don't realize when they talk about a lynching that it took place right up here in this town.
Selling postcards of the hanging, painting the passports brown.
And when they had sailors, I was thinking New York, I wasn't thinking Duluth, Minnesota. So all the elements of that, and it's those kind of like aha moments have occurred quite a few times.
Yeah, that you can only get if you're here.
Right, exactly. That's the point.
Yeah,
And I think I gained a perspective being here because coming from somewhere else, I was like the only Bob Dylan fan I knew, but I knew he's from Minnesota. So when I got to Minnesota, I kind of thought, well, everyone must think Bob Dylan's the greatest because he is, and now I'm in his home state. So that's one of the, impetuses for this book was like finding out that there's people that kind of resent Bob Dylan for leaving Minnesota. Not a lot of recording artists spend their life in Hibbing. So that was the thing I wanted to kind of discover and like interview people and ask them like what is their opinion on Bob Dylan and dig into that. So that's meeting so many people in the Bob Dylan fan world. It's been really cool to meet so many other people that do like his music, but also to kind of explore that, like what is it about that makes that kind of reputation that some people kind of don't aren't proud of it or whatever. So I like exploring that.
Yeah, and that might not be something you pick up if you lived in California, So
Matt does a great thing talking about, and I can't remember if it was in the book, but I follow him on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, about, because everybody says, and I heard it just the other day at the Willie Nelson concert, Dylan doesn't care about Hibbing or Duluth or Minnesota. But you referenced several points in his writing where he speaks very fondly of the Northland. Why don't you mention that?
Right, yeah, that's basically what I added to the book mostly, other than like addresses of places he went to school and stuff. But also in interviews over the years, it's one of the things that's been very consistent is that when he's asked about Minnesota, he's always very straightforward in his answers, which he often isn't about a lot of other topics. But when people ask him about Minnesota, he usually gives very serious and very positive answers about his upbringing here. And in his songs, there's lots of instances of him referencing Minnesota in a positive way. And again, if you're not really steeped in it, you might not know that on the surface level. So I tried to include a lot of that stuff in the book too, so people would see that he has said very nice things about Minnesota in the past.
Yeah, that's great, and that's the truth, and that's all in the book, folks. Let's see, we're Bob Dylan in Minnesota, or if you just came into Wussow's here, we're having the John Bushey Memorial Lecture for the 2024 Dylan Fest, and we have 4 of the main authors of the book. K.G. Miles is the organizer and put it all together out of England, but he recruited these 4 guys, Minnesotans, to kind of boots on the ground, investigate Bob's impact on Minnesota, and it also serves as a real tourist guide for people who aren't from Minnesota and are more curious about Dylan. Let's continue on with some of the questions. Talk about the tourist aspect of it. If you weren't from Minnesota, where would the first place you would go if you were a Bob Dylan curious? Whose turn is it? I guess it's probably we're down to Matt down there. I think it's kind of your turn to kick off an answer.
Well, I've never been to New York. I would love to go to Greenwich Village. I've never been there. Or Malibu, his house in Malibu, if he'd let me. I'd like to hang out there.
Paul, how about you? If you just...
Well, I actually kind of referenced that in my book, for sale at next door. But we had I've also got a radio show Saturday mornings now called Stars of the Prairie on KDAL. and we were talking a little bit. So I had two of the gentlemen on. Matt was driving up, and I remember, and I told this story, and when Dylan played in Bayfront Park in 1999 or 2000 with Paul Simon, they were doing interviews with a lot of old codgers on the Iron Range in Duluth. And now when I say old codgers, they were probably the age that I am now. And but they asked one guy in Hibbing, they said, have you ever seen Dylan up here? He goes, nah, not that I could say for sure, but we did see a long black stretch limo drive through town last summer with a canoe on top. But here's what I said in my book, and I really believe this. I really, I mean, I've been inspired by Dylan, of course, his music and his poetry and his worldview, but I've been inspired as much as his Iron Range work ethic. I mean, there's really nobody in the modern entertainment world for the last 60 years that have suffered the slings and arrows of criticism and stood unbowed as Bob Dylan. That's, right? So I answer that at the end of this piece, but I'll just read when you're talking about where should people go, and I would suggest any bar on the Iron Range. Okay, this is the first part of Highway 53, revisited. You can walk into any Iron Range bar on the weekend and see any of the 5 character types imbued in Bob Dylan's persona. The greaser, dressed in black leather jacket, white t-shirt with a pack of Lucky Strikes rolled up in his sleeve, dark sunglasses, leather belt buckled on the side, and engineer boots. The hard-working miner, fresh off his second shift, enjoying a cold one before going home to the wife and kids. The asshole protesting that his drink is not strong enough and that it costs too much, or the trickster doing card tricks at the bar and gambling with loaded dice, or perhaps the weirdo in the back booth drinking cheap brandy straight up and reading James Joyce. That's Bob Dylan and Paul Metsa right there.
I'd just like to add a story. I was in a bar that's now closed in Superior a number of years ago, talking to the owner, and a young guy sat down next to me on the bar stool, and he's listening, and we were talking about Dylan, and all of a sudden he perked up and he said, I want to apologize. I said, apologize for what? He said, well, my father threw Bob down a flight of stairs once. Well, there's stories everywhere.
Most of them are true. Some of them maybe not. Mark, how about you? You know,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. Where would you, recommend people go? You know what I mean?
Ed's story is funny because this, just along with what he just said, in Minnesota, Minneapolis, there was this fraternity house called the Sammy House. We write about it in the book.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And everybody's bragging. It's a Jewish fraternity. Saying, I kicked Bobby out, and I kicked him out of this scrawny little Jewish kid out of there. I kicked him out. He stunk and he was loud. Bob told me personal stories about that. He said, number one, they didn't kick me out, he said. Don't pledge there. You don't want to pledge there. I was going to the U of M too. I went to the U of M, and he said, "Yeah, you just don't want to pledge there." So I was a magician. I did a magic show there for the what do you call when you start out at a fraternity? It's the opening, whatever. I can't remember now.
Rush.
Yeah. Okay, so I did that, and I split, and never went back there again. They still talk about the piano, and I kicked him out. I don't know why they're bragging about that. Why is that cool to say you kicked out a Nobel Prize winner out of the fraternity house that nobody gives a shit about? It's closed now. Anyhow, we put it in the book, and I thought that was funny. But in terms of sights to see, we got the good ones in our book. Definitely the 2 homes that this man owns. I would start there.
Yeah.
And in fact, we needed a picture of the Hibbing home because we're not big on pictures in the book. There's some good ones in there. But we had a picture of the Duluth home sent in by maybe you, Bill, sent us that picture. And the Hibbing home wasn't in there. We got the picture of Matt and his family in there on the doorstep, on the front yard of it. So that was cool. We needed that. And I recommended the new bench in Hibbing that the Hibbing Dillon Project put out. That's a must-see. I haven't seen it yet in person, but I've watched all the videos and the groundbreaking and all that, and that's beautiful. I would see that. I would see everything that's in our book, and then I would do, like Matt says, do some of the New York stuff. But there's things on him all over the world you can see, you know? Everywhere. So I don't have any really bucket list of places I want to see on him, but things he visited or, did. The Newport's pretty big when he revolutionized.
Yeah, and that's still going, right? I mean, the Newport Folk Festival, so
Yes.
the legacy that he started there.
So I helped on the mural. I don't know how many of you have seen the Bob Dylan mural in Minneapolis on 5th and Hennepin. So I helped do that with the Hennepin Theater Trust. We had 3 images of Bob, and one was, I talk about it in the book, one was a smoking Bob, the classic shot of him imitating Woody Guthrie. So the Hennepin Theater Trust reviewed that, and they said, we can't have a 5 foot by 5 foot story guy smoking on Hennepin Avenue. They didn't want to get into that. They changed that, and then it became a shot by Daniel Kramer, who just passed away and all that. So I helped do a consultant on that, and then they got it finished in 10 days, and there's a whole chapter in the book. They wanted to throw a party in the parking lot. Somebody to sing Times Are Changing. So I picked one guy to do that. This guy could sing Times Are Changing in the parking lot as good as the man himself. It went on, and I think they were trying to contact Bob. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll show up there, but I'm not singing. He said. So then it phased away. The Eduardo Cobra did the mural in 10 days, cover to cover. It was a blank wall, and in 10 days they did that. It was
gorgeous.
It's one of the 7 wonders of the world.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I mean, I think.
The other thing, and it was kind of, I wrote the intro, but the other thing I really wanted to include was a piece on Bob's 11th and 12th grade British literature, humanities, and English teacher, a guy named B.J. Ralston. So getting back to what you're saying, what place should you visit? You've got to go to the Hibbing High School. It was built in 1924 to the tune of $4 million. The mining companies wanted to move it, so the mayor at the time, do you know what's the mayor's name? Yeah, Mayor Power said, okay, we'll move the city, but you've got to build our high school. $4 million in 1924. I mean, what is that, 60 million a day? Anyway, I was actually playing in Bennett Park about 15 years ago, and our friend Nelson, younger brother Greg, owned Bob Dylan's house in Hibbing before Bill bought it, and he was sitting next to this really cool-looking dude who had a white shirt. I mean, just like you picture a late 70s very respectable man. He had a white shirt with a tie on a Saturday, a cool hat, a blue windbreaker, then he had his 3-wheeler that he was trucking around on the park with. And so Greg introduced me. He said, I think you would like to meet this guy. He said, this is B.J. Ralston. And his reputation preceded him.
Yeah, the teacher.
And he was a very nice man. He goes, he reminded me of Jerry Lee Lewis with a guitar. So I liked him even more already. So I said, when I come up here as soon as I can, I'd like to interview you, because I'd heard what a great influence he was on Bob Dylan. My high school English teacher, Tom Moeller, had retired from teaching in Virginia and he became a videographer. So I called up Tom and I said, hey, I'd like to interview this guy, B.J. Ralston. He goes, B.J. and I go riding on my motorcycle 2 or 3 times a week. And B.J. had like a World War I helmet on, and he put him on the back, and Tom had a really nice one of his Honda motorcycles. They threw about 6 CDs in, played a lot of Bob Dylan. They cruised all around the outskirts of Dillon. So I finally, so he goes, yeah, I'm very good friends with BJ. In fact, Tom decided to go from sports into English after he took classes from BJ at Hibbing Community College. So it was the perfect setup. And then it's kind of like a little bit of BJ's magic.
Yeah, that's cool.
Second in. So we went up to his house, And you walk in, he had a lovely wife, cookies and coffee. I mean, it was so sweet. I arranged Saturday afternoon. And so we sat down, and BJ pulled out a stack of poems, some that he had written and some by his favorite writers like Joseph Conrad and Walt Whitman. And so we spent about 45 minutes, and I got it. I got exactly how he affected Bob Dylan, not only with the great literature he was teaching, but when he, and you can find this interview on YouTube, just Paul Metsa with B.J. Rolfson, R-O-L-F-Z-E-N. But he would read these poems a couple times. He got a tear in his eye because they were so, and affected him so much. And he read it like a Shakespearean actor. So we had this beautiful 45 minutes, and then we were just kind of freestyling. And he said, yeah, when Bob was up for his, I believe it was for his father's funeral, BJ was in the back of the synagogue, and when Bob walked by, he went up to BJ and said, BJ said, you're my greatest influence.
Oh man, how about that? Yeah, that's something. Yeah. You know, Paul brings up something too that comes to mind too. It's like this book is about the places, you know, to visit where Bob, you know, that touched Bob's life. But what about Minnesotans, people? I mean, maybe the panel could talk about Paul mentions, you know, P.J. Rolfson, the teacher. About the panel, any Minnesotans that kind of come to mind that kind of helped shape Bob Dylan?
Spider John.
Yes, Spider John, of course.
Number one.
Yeah, talk about Spider John. How did
Say
he...
it himself. I'll let him tell you a little bit of Spider John.
Let me tell you a story about Mark's mother. Okay?
Yeah.
If you ever knew Marilyn Perkansky, you were a very lucky human being. So I met Mark, literally almost 40 years ago. He was a young teenager hanging out at Orfolk Jokepa's record store, and I had just put my first LP out, Paper Tigers. So I was running around consigning it to all the stores. And for some reason, Mark and I, we kind of caught each other's eyes. And I said, hey, you might enjoy this record. So I gave him a record. Well, we became lifelong friends. And I got to know his mother. Now, his mother was an old friends with Bob Dylan. I probably seen about 30 plus Dylan shows in my life. And when Marilyn was alive and be able to get around, you knew if you were at the show, Marilyn was going to be in the first 4 rows, probably in the first 2. And she always had this feather hat and boas, and it was a little bit of Marilyn Monroe and a little bit of Jackie O, and with a little more of a rock and roll feel.
Before I ever met Mark, I remember seeing him and his mom, because once you noticed him, you'd see him every time.
She had a little bit of Elvira in her too, and I mean that in a good way. But anyway, so I saw him. So we also were good friends with Larry Keegan, and Larry was
there's another one.
Oh yeah, well he was a childhood buddy of Bob's. When he was a teenager, was in a diving accident, lost the use of his legs, and when he was in mid to late 20s, got in a car accident in Mexico and became a quadriplegic. But Bob, I think Bob was dedicated, was it Street Legal? Street Legal too. And there's a great picture. You should go around where Larry Keegan's on stage and Bob's playing saxophone behind him. He got, because Larry and Bob grew up singing, doo-wop and blues together. But anyway, so a lot of us, Larry got a lot of my tickets, and Mark had his in, so we always see each other. It was like I was a little family reunion, kind of Manson family with some of us, but a family reunion at these Dylan shows. And so I see Marilyn, and she's dead. We're in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, right by the river. It's this beautiful afternoon, and so we're outside and hanging out before the show, and she goes, Paul, I gotta ask you a question. I go, I'll let you. Well, I just was talking to Bobby. He thinks I'm wearing too much jewelry for this concert. He was worried about it. I said, Marilyn, if you were wearing that kind of jewelry at a Run DMC concert at Madison Square Garden, I'd say, be on your best behavior. But I said, a Bob Dylan concert in Eau Claire next to the river, I think you're going to be safe and sound.
I heard about him when I met him at Orfolk. I had already known about him. but my mom didn't, and I was happy to meet him. I don't know, he handed me the record. I would have bought it anyhow. Paper Tigers. I was 17, 18 years old, and I knew all about him. I've been following him his whole career. Whether he likes it or not, I follow him. He's got a lot of great songs, and he is the other great folk singer from the Iron Range, and I'm never going to take that from him. And
Thank you.
4-time author. Bob's only a 1-time author, right? Chronicles, well, twice, a couple books, but
He's got time to catch up.
He's got time to catch up. So, Tarantula, yes.
Philosophy of modern song.
There you go. We're lucky to have Paul Metsa wherever he goes. We miss him in Minneapolis. He played every nook and cranny in Minneapolis, so he had to come here. I hope you're treating him well. Blackwater Lounge
Every Wednesday.
has got him here, and it's a great thing. We miss him in Minneapolis. But and I told my mom about him. I said I met Paul Metsa. You did. She was a fan too, and we went to many concerts of his through the years, and he always treated us right. And he always gave her a big hug after every show that she was at
lovely.
with Larry Keegan. And Larry Keegan is a mere mortal. We have another mere mortal in the house back there, Mr. Gene LeBond.
All right, Gino.
Thank you, Gino, for coming. Another old friend of mine. Probably go back the furthest in this house. Bill Pagel goes back very far. I've known him a long time. Known a lot of you a long time. Thank you all for coming and showing up.
Anybody that comes to mind, you know, Minnesotan?
Throw Buddy Holly in there at the Armory,
okay.
and then throw in Albert Wilson.
Oh yeah. Talk about Albert, Ed. Yeah, I think that's a really good one. Unsung.
He was the oldest living
Civil War soldier.
Civil War in the North, and if you go to the beginning of Bob Dylan Way over by the library and by the Armory, you'll see a statue, and his house was right around the corner from Bob, about 100 feet, and the kids used to walk over to Nettleton School and salute Mr. Wilson. And
Yeah, there's a picture in the book, and
And that's where I think Bob developed the initial embers for his lifelong fascination with the Civil War.
correct.
You know, he'd go out to the New York Public Library and read about it. But one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs that I don't even think it was on a record, but there's a beautiful video. If you ever want to see Bob Dylan riding a horse with a fake beard, this is what you want to see. But it's a beautiful song called "Across the Green Mountain." Have you seen it?
Oh, yeah.
Heard it?
Yeah.
Is it one of Bob Dylan's 10 best?
Absolutely. Solid.
But I swear to God, it started with recognizing Albert Wilson just a half a block down the alley from him.
and other Minnesotans, like, you know, Echo, you know, I mean, a Minnesotan, one of his first girlfriends, and Louis Camp, we haven't talked about him yet either.
I would throw out, now this was not an influence on Bob, but the first Nobel Prize winner for literature in the U.S., from the U.S., was Sinclair Lewis. And he was here in Duluth researching a book about racism called King's Blood Royal. And so the first and last Nobel Prize winners for literature were both here in Duluth at the same time.
Minnesotans, yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I read a little bit in the book about how he sees himself in that lineage, and there's actually a quote about that in Chronicles. I can just read it really quick. He said, Roger Maris was breaking Babe Ruth's home run record the year he arrived in New York in 1961, and in Chronicles, Bob writes, "Of course, I had never heard of him there. Nobody did. I was hearing a lot about him now, though, and so was the rest of the land. On some level, I guess I took pride in being from the same town. There were others, too, from Minnesota that I felt akin to. Charles Lindbergh, the first aviator to fly nonstop across the Atlantic. He was from Little Falls. F. Scott Fitzgerald, a descendant of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, and who himself wrote the Great Gatsby, was from St. Paul. Fitzgerald was called the prophet of the Jazz Age. Sinclair Lewis won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was from Sauk Center, Minnesota. And then there was Eddie Cochran, one of the early rock and roll geniuses who was from Albert Lee, Minnesota. Native sons, adventurers, prophets, writers, and musicians. They were all from the North Country. Each one followed their own vision, didn't care what the pictures showed. Each one of them would have understood what my inarticulate dreams were about. I felt like I was one of them or all of them put together."
Yeah, and he also mentions Judy Garland too.
Yeah,
which-
Grand Rapids.
Yeah, from Grand Rapids, and she kind of said if he thought that if she made it, obviously, I can make it too. And she was probably one of the first big pop stars from Minnesota.
And here's another little trivia fact that some of you could win a barroom bet. The other very well-known, not as well-known as Bob, rock and roll singer from Hibbing. Can anybody mention it? Gary Puckett and the Union Gap.
On my question was here to talk about. I think one of the reason why he's such a great artist is his ability, to surprise people, with his music, with what he does, just, as a person too. I think about, there's a story of him skiing at Spirit Mountain, it's like you don't think of him skiing, right? But there he is, and talk about, I know in my life I've, run across, I saw Bob Dylan at a Metrodome baseball game with the Twins, that was just shocking, there he is in the front row. And, is there a story that you can relate to where somebody, some connection to Bob kind of surprised you that, hey, I can't believe this is happening, and it wouldn't have happened unless Bob.
Well, I'm going to just jump in for a minute because you touched on something. Bob Dylan is really the quintessential American who's done his homework. He is a folk and blues scholar. He knows more about folk, blues, rock and roll, country, and doo-wop than just about any other performing musician out there. It has all those styles has informed him. Combine that with the great tutelage of B.J. Rawlson, and then his own inner drive to learn more and read. He reads the Talmud and the Old and New Testament. The guy is just an extremely literate human being that understands the last 100+ years of American culture, and it is to take that background and to create his art out of that. And that's why I think we relate, even though you might not love Bob Dylan, there's something that you can relate to him because every part of his being has a little swath of American culture in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's for 60 years he's been doing that. Man, you had something.
Yeah, well, that's the fun part about being a fan of his is that you never know when he's going to show up in a Victoria's Secret ad or an IBM ad, or he just does what he wants to do. He marches to the beat of his own drum to the extent that no one else can because he's earned that credibility in his profession that no one can second guess him. He does what he wants to do, and it's so fun to see what he decides to do at any given moment. But thinking about a moment that surprised me and that I thought said a lot about who he is was when we were at Midway Stadium in 2013 and he played a tribute to Bobby V. So Bobby V was a contemporary of his, even became famous before he did, and Bob looked up to Bobby V and Bobby V was dying of Alzheimer's at the time, and came and visited Bob backstage before the show, and then Bob played one of Bobby V's songs as a tribute to him and talked about him a little bit. But that moment, it said a few different things. One was that Bob is a very sentimental person, that he's a very loyal person to his friends. I've run into plenty of people who would say that they think they know what Bob Dylan's like because they saw Don't Look Back, which is an hour of him when he was 24 and just became world famous. So that always seems like such a bad sample size to take and think you know what a person's like. But that Bobby V moment really showed how he values his past. He's a sentimental person. He's a nostalgic person. It also shows that he does talk in concert sometimes when he has something to say, which goes against what some people think. And it shows that he is a child of the 50s. Even though he became world famous as a representation of the 60s, he really identifies with and loves the 1950s. And Bobby V was a hero of his as growing up. He wanted to be part of Bobby V's band. So to play a tribute song for Bobby V and share what Bobby V meant to him and say he was the most meaningful person he ever played with was a guy that he played with when he was 18 before he was even famous.
And the great story about that I love. So he goes up to Fargo. He's calling himself Elston Gunn, and gets a job playing piano in Bobby V's band. Well, now back then, there wasn't really electric pianos like we know them years later. So if Bob would play piano when there was a piano at the gig.
Right.
So Bobby V explains to, well, there's not pianos everywhere we're going to play. And this goes to show you Bob's quick mind and his love of improvisation. He goes, no big deal, I'll just do hand claps.
Mark, how about you? Anything
Yeah.
Bob surprised you? You know, like, wow.
Well, a lot of the public one, the great one was at the Live Aid when he came out there, played acoustic, and then he didn't really like it so much. They had him on at the end, and Keith Richards and Ron Wood came out, and they really bombed the whole thing over the whole world. And he said, why don't you take some of the money and give it to the farmers here in America? Said that there, and that started Farm Aid.
Yeah, he started
Willie
one of the
Nelson.
biggest.
So that was a real surprise. He does things like that. He just stays true to himself and tries to put it out there, things. And I'll give you one example of him. One thing here's something you never heard. There was a Pete Townsend. I'm a big fan of Pete Townsend of The Who, and used to show Bob stuff like that, and he came out and he was interested to know. And I used to see Springsteen a lot, and he goes, how many times you got to see that guy, he says to me. And why do they keep booing him? And why does he work so hard when he does his shows? He said that. Anyhow, so I said, I don't know. He's a great performer, Bob. All right, he says. So then I got this album by Pete Townsend in 1982 called "All the Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes." It was a solo album of Pete. So I show it to Bob. It's vinyl. And he says, that's a painted album cover. He says to me, Pete's all painted up on that. I says, Bob, I'm showing you this because there's a song on here called "North Country Girl." I want you to hear. North Country Girl, all right, put it on. I put it on for him. North Country Girl, written and performed, or maybe arranged by Pete Townsend. Now, I met The Who because my mom was a caterer with Hartley Frank and the Longhorn Bar, and we met all the stars and all that. So we backstage, and I'm meeting Pete, and so I play the song for Bob. It's pretty identical to his song. I played it for Bob, and he goes, what is Pete talking about? That's my song. I wrote that song, Girl from the North Country. Tell Pete I wrote that song, he says to him. So I'm at The Who's farewell tour in 1982, and I'm playing pinball with Pete back there, doing a little magic for him. And then Bob and Pete had, The Who had the same security guard at the time, Jim Callahan, a great guy and a fun guy. And so I'm showing it to Pete. I said, Pete, Bob says he wrote this song. He says, he did? Well, no, he didn't. He said, well, it's pretty close to Girl from the North Country, one of your greatest songs of all time. He didn't write that song, and I'll tell you why. He says, that song has roots. It has a lot of roots in it, and Scarborough Fair, and Martin Carthy actually wrote it, I think is what he told me, and I'm pretty young, and I'm hearing this, and tell Bob I wrote that song. He didn't write that song. So I tell Bob the song, I'm in an argument between Pete Townsend and Bob Dylan, who they both like each other. I know they have. It's been seen in the press and public together. They both like each other, but they're great minds, and they're telling me this stuff. So he says, oh, that's funny. He says, and Bob started laughing about it. He said, I wrote that song, and that's the end of it, Girl from the North Country. One of your greatest songs of all, written up here. The winds hit heavy on the borderline, So that was a surprising story to me.
That's classic. Thanks for that one. Yeah, that's a good one. And how about you? The surprising, like
Two stories come to mind. One, we came here in 1986, and front page story is the city council being opposed to having a Bob Dylan Way in this town. They were fighting about where to have it, and then they were fighting about whether to have it, and it took 20 years for that to happen. And when it finally did happen, they had to raise their own money. Don Dass, the late Don Dass, and Don Ness and Steve O'Neill, they were the committee that finally persuaded that to happen, and they had to raise their own money to put the signs up.
It's just shocking, yeah.
Anyway, that was pretty surprising. Another surprise for me was learning that the whole time that Woodstock was happening, we mentioned Isle of Wight earlier. Bob was packing to go to the Isle of Wight, which K.G. Miles actually talked about its influence on him.
So he missed Woodstock because he was packing his luggage.
Yeah, he was.
But Woodstock attracted such a large crowd, and I have heard this because they thought Bob was to show up there.
Oh, yeah.
True?
Yeah.
That's why it got to be such a huge crowd.
A lot of stars at that one.
Yeah.
We could wrap things up here. We're over an hour. I think we want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions too. Yeah, who wants to start? Laura?
Yeah, okay, so talk more about how the Iron Range influenced his worldview, please.
How did Iron Range influence
That particular.
Well, I think
worldview?
what I referenced in that piece I wrote was his work ethic. But he grew up until the president before this. The Iron Range was very DFL. I mean, say 90% of the people voted Democrat. There was also a lot of socialists up there, and a lot of the Finlanders, my brood, came out fulfilled with their social ideas. My grandmother was Unitarian, which is like communism without having to hold a placard up. And so I think, there's a lot of, in fact, I've thought about it, like City Fathers to endorse. There's so many lines in Bob Dylan songs that represent city government, different things. And back there, the DFL was really active, and it was also the start of, because once again, my Finnish ancestors were some of the first food co-ops and electrical co-ops. In fact, I was reading, I found a thing when I was going through my archives. My great-grandfather, who settled in Angora, Minnesota, and built the Metsa homestead, they had the funeral at the farmhouse, but it was it said mortuary co-op, which I still have to go back and figure that whole thing out. But I think so. You have the combination of strong democratic principles, growing up with Harry Truman, FDR, and you've got all the one of the guy that ran for communism for years, Gus Hall, was from Cherry, which was 50 miles from Imig. So I think when you can combine all the best of that modern democracy, American democracy, with the underlying of the unions and the socialist ideas, I think it makes for a very, can turn a young man or woman into a very broad-minded human.
Yeah, absorbing all that as a teenager. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Anybody else on the Iron Range?
I remember interview with about Bob once that his brother said that he liked to date the daughters of miners, and that Hibbing had a lot of working class people, and Bob being from a Jewish family, there was that was questionable to some people, and he was aware of those social differences in the culture there. His love of nature, I think, his sense of humor, his hard work, his work ethic, as Paul said. There's a few others actually. I have notes, a couple of the other, because this is one of the things outlined in my chapter. With B.J. Ralston, we talked about the emphasis on the arts was there because Hibbing was the biggest city in that area, and it was looked at as a prestigious way. It paid the best, so it got the best teachers coming from East Coast colleges. And when Bob won the Nobel, he said, when I started writing my own songs, the folk lingo was the only vocabulary that I knew, but I had something else as well. I had the principles and sensibilities and an informed view of the world, and I'd had that for a while. I learned it all the way back in grammar school. So that's an indictment right there on his childhood. And also one other, just kind of the weirdness of some of his early songs, the way that culture was back then. Just television had just come on the scene. Like, there were traveling tent shows and circuses that he talks about going to when he was a kid and seeing blackface artists. And a lot more musicians had to travel to make money back then. So we saw Conway Twitty and even claimed to have played with him, even though he didn't. So we saw a lot of different musicians come through. We saw the circuses and the county fairs. And when you listen to a song like Desolation Row, you can hear the idea, characters from Shakespeare and modern day characters, like all just intertwined in like these weird ways. And it has to, at some level, have come from seeing all those circuses and carny shows and that sort of thing when he was a kid.
There's one little connection with myself, my hometown, Virginia. So that circus where the tragedy of the 3 young black circus workers who were taken out and hung, that circus played in my hometown of Virginia the next night.
What was that called?
Huh? I forget what the name of the circus was.
Ed, did you have something on the Iron Range?
I did, but I lost my train of thought going.
Another question? Oh, go ahead.
Bob's uncles owned all the theaters, so
Right.
he saw a lot of Hollywood movies,
Yeah.
and if you go through his catalog, there's just so much references to
All
Gregory
that
Peck and all the other stars.
Yeah, all that exposure you got at a young age. Yeah.
Well, Jimmy Dean and Marlon Brando. I think those are two.
Now we got a question in the back.
Right.
I've got an observation. The mural on Hennepin. We live on East Hennepin, just across the bridge in Northeast. That mural, year after year after year, is virtually graffiti free.
Yes.
How where everybody will spray, cover everything. Not that one.
Yeah. And they're not. I have a little quick thing on that, and it's in the book too. They did it with the Brazilians, and then there was a lady and a gentleman who were from here to keep an eye on it to make sure. But I think you're right. There is no graffiti to it. That's right. No one wants to touch it.
Yeah.
That's
Jill,
true.
Jill has a question over here.
The Walls of Red Wing. Do you have anything to say about that song and the connection there? How did he come up with that?
Yeah, kind
He
of
didn't
a-
spend time.
The question is one of Bob's deep tracks, The Walls of Red Wing. How did that?
As one, if I might, as one who grew up in Hibbing, they're deathly afraid of being sent to Red Wing
Yeah.
or Thistledew. Red Wing or Thistledew, right?
Or Evelyn. That's our old joke.
Yeah, Ed.
An
Good one.
example of
Nelson.
people, because I'm writing about these things on my blog, I learned that the organist from First Presbyterian Church when we first came to Duluth, her husband was the teenager that Bob drove down to Red Wing and picked him up and drove him home. And his daughter contacted me, and we corresponded, and I got the rest of the story, which you can find on my blog. So,
Yeah, Walls of Red Wing. We had another question back there. Yeah. Is that Gene?
My favorite quote, we were talking about the Iron Range, and the favorite quote that I heard attributed to Bob was, he said, I grew up in an area of people where you go and wouldn't let go of the hand of the drowning man.
Wow. Say that again, Gino. One more time. A little louder.
Louder microphone.
Yeah.
I grew up in an area of people that you knew would not let go of the hand of a drowning man.
Yeah, beautiful.
Great.
Sounds
I
like a
have
great
another
lyric, yeah.
quote that's
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, Laura.
Okay, so the amazing thing about Bob Dylan is, I mean, he was in Hibbing, and cars weren't that awesome, and anyway, it takes a little while to drive back and forth between Duluth and Hibbing, but there's so many connections between his family, and then Duluth, and then the cities, and then Camp Herschel. They were all over the place. And he's driving, I mean, that guy had so much freedom at a young age. And anyway.
I interviewed a guy named Johnny Western who was born in Two Harbors. His real name was Johnny Westerland. He was born in 1934. He was raised in a CC camp in Brimson. They used to bring in a screen and show Gene Autry movies. When this little Johnny goes, that's what I want to become, a singing cowboy. They moved down. He started playing guitar down in Northfield. He ends up going to Hollywood when he was about 18 years old, gets in a posse scene in a Gene Autry movie. One thing leads to another, and I think we got an age group here that will understand. Johnny Western, and Google the guy, incredible career, he's still alive, closing in on 90. He wrote and sang the theme song to Have Gun Will Travel, the Ballad of Paladin, which was the second most popular Western show behind, Matt Dillon and Gunsmoke. But anyway, so I was re-listening to the interview I did with him about 8 years ago, and he told, because everybody knows Bob Dylan came down to see Buddy Holly at the Armory. So I dug up this piece of the interview. He said, when Bob first, and then Johnny ended up playing with Johnny Cash for 7 years and put out 7 records on Columbia Gunfighter Ballads, produced by Don Law, who was the guy that recorded Robert Johnson. But he told me a story that Johnny Cash told him. When Bob Dylan first met Johnny Cash in Nashville, he talked about, when you're saying going on being free, he hitchhiked down when he was 16 years old or 17 years old to see Johnny Cash at the Duluth Armory, which is another thing to put on the hit list for what's going on at the Armory. Hitchhiked down, and what he told Johnny, according to Johnny Wester, he said, "Johnny, I breathed you."
Whoa. Yeah. Any other questions for the panel? On Bob? Yeah.
Where in the country would be his most expensive exhibit of painting? And the same question about his artwork.
His artworks. The question is, where would we see some of his artworks, or some of the best places to see Bob Dylan's artwork, his paintings and sculpture? Yeah, his ironworks.
It was in Rome last year when I was there. 2 people in this room were there.
And I saw there was a display at the Frost Museum in Miami 2 years ago.
Frost Museum in Miami?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if it's still
But
there.
there's somebody, one of the major museums in London that has a lot of his work.
Halcyon Gallery.
Tulsa, doesn't it?
Halcyon.
There's artwork in Tulsa. A lot of artwork in
Bob
Tulsa.
Dylan.
And where's the train car, Bill?
It's in France.
It's in France. Yeah, I had a chance to go there, but I didn't want to be on a train all day.
Some of the artwork is my commission. Bill Clinton has a piece. Bob gives it out to some people, and there's not
National Harbor has a gate, I think, right?
Yes, so but that's a great question. Great question, because it's not one.
And I might add, I've been talking with the Heaven's Door guys, and they've got the new distillery in Kentucky now.
You can get whiskey anywhere.
Whiskey, but they're also still working on that church in Nashville. So it's my understanding that some of the art and some of the metalwork may be on display at those locations in the future.
So keep your eyes peeled.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
In the book, there's a picture of the book called Drawn Blank, which was the first one of the. He did write drawings in his writings and drawings books when he was, he was always doodled. But the Drawn Blank book was the first one. It came out in 1994, and there's a picture of it in the book. He autographed it to my mom. I won't spoil the surprise, it's a spoiler, but ever since the past 15, 20 years, there's been a nice exhibit. The gallery in London, the Halcyon Gallery, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, and then there's been artwork in New York. His management sets up, and his artwork, they set up different exhibits, and they keep it rotating. And it's been rotating like for the past 15, 20 years. All of his art shows. I think it sounds like he's preferring to have them as art shows and not one particular place that you can go to in art, because infinity goes up on trial.
Yeah.
Right?
We had a question down here in front.
Good question.
Well, I haven't heard much mention of his influence of Woody Guthrie, and it seems like it was really important early on.
Yeah, Woody Guthrie panel. How Woody influenced Bob?
Well, he read Bound for Glory and discovered Woody in Minneapolis. So
He got it from Diamond Dave Whitaker, who's still with us.
Yes.
And Dave's got 86 or 87. He's just the last living freaking beatnik. And I bumped into him. They had a Dinkytown reunion about 8 years ago, and he tells the story about he turned Bob onto him the night Bob was crashing at his house. He said by the morning, Bob had finished the book. Dave never saw Bound for Glory again. But that was the key. That was the turning point. And then when he goes out to New York, and I say this in my book, and I use it as a punchline because it's true. So Diamond Dave Whitaker and another guy named Dave Morton, who's a friend of mine, gave Bob Dylan a ride in January to hitchhike out to New York in 1963. And I say, who but an Iron Ranger would take his guitar and hitchhike to New York in the middle of January but an Iron Ranger?
Right, yeah. Good. Yeah. Any other questions?
Steve,
To see what you got there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Greystone Hospital.
Yeah, it's really up to you though. If you want Paps, I'll get you.
All right, well, good. Let's we can wrap things up here. A couple announcements before we wrap things up. Want to make sure that everybody knows at 5 o'clock from 5 to 6 on 101.3, Marion will be leading the Highway 61 Revisited radio show, which of course was founded by the lecture sponsor here, John Bushey. And also tonight, Dylan Fest dance party with Cowboy Angel Blue at Mr. D's Bar and Grill, which is just across the street over there and a block away. So not far from here, so get over there and see Cowboy Angel Blue. It's a great thing. I wanted to thank Zane Bale for setting this all up. Let's give Zane a big hand. Yeah, and let's give Wussow a big hand for hosting. That's great. And let's give our 4 panelists a big hand. And you can pick up the book from Zane in the back or next door at Zenith Books. And Paul has a little thing he wants to leave us with from his own book.
Yeah, and this is, and buy every book. I mean, I think there is 900 books out on Bob Dylan.
But tonight only 2.
But yeah. But anyway, I wrote this after seeing Bob Dylan at the Beacon Theater in 2019 in New York City. And I've seen Dylan many times in Minnesota, but you really got to see Dylan in New York because they really claim him as their own, and rightfully so in a way. But my friend, Sunbonnet Sue, is here, and we're both big fans of Charlie Sexton, who played with Bob Hughes. She's got a huge crush on him. I just think he's a great guitar player who happens to be really good looking. But anyway, so I wrote this at the end of the chapter Highway 53 Revisited. And I was talking about his show. Laurence Olivier meeting Little Richard on a tightrope with Billy the Kid holding a net beneath them. Art in both the smallest and largest of moments, the American spirit at its core. He is both a man and a concept that has evolved over dozens of incarnations, withstanding waves of criticism from all corners, and remains unbowed. There is a lesson in that, steel forged from iron ore. At the end of this day, and in particular after these shows, it was easy to realize that Dylan and his band could kickstart any VFW or juke joint dance floor anywhere at midnight in America. As he proffers and transmits the ghosts of all that made this country beautiful and, more importantly, mystical. And he is probably fine with that. With his guitar, has his lunch pail off to work, he is gone like any other ordinary Joe for more than 60 years. We are lucky to share this time on Earth. And lest we forget, he still has the best hair in the business.
All right, thanks for coming, everybody.
Let's hear it for MARC Nicklawske, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody, and don't forget we have a farewell brunch here tomorrow, too, at 11 a.m., and so come on and join us again here at Wussow's. Thanks again to Dylan Fest, and see you over at Mr. D's.